11:30 at night, June the 13th, 1886. A search party moves along the edge of Lake Starnberg, lanterns swinging, boots sinking into it grass. 2 men have been missing since 7 o'clock that evening, a king and the doctor assigned to watch him. They find them close together, in water barely deep enough to cover a man's knees, both dead. The official report, written within hours, will call it a tragedy. A troubled king recently declared insane, drowning himself in grief, and a loyal doctor dying in a failed attempt to save him. But here is the detail the report leaves out, the detail that will follow this case for the next 140 years. There was no water in the king's lungs. A man cannot drown without inhaling water, and a strong swimmer, which this king undeniably was, does not drown in a lake barely deeper than his own boots. Something happened on that shore. The only question that has never been answered is what, and more importantly, who benefited. Every great mystery needs a scene, a body, and a list of suspects. This one has all three, and it has something rarer still, a 200-room fairy tale castle standing today as physical evidence of the motive. Millions of tourists walk through Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria every year, taking photographs of the very towers that may have gotten its builder killed. Today, we are going to treat this the way a detective would treat any cold case. We're going to meet the victim. We're going to meet every person who stood to gain from his death. And at the end, you're going to decide, the same way historians still argue about it today, who you believe actually killed the King of Bavaria. His name was Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, and by the standards of most 19th century monarchs, he was a spectacularly bad king and a spectacularly interesting man. He came to the throne at 18 in 1864, inheriting a small German kingdom that was rapidly being swallowed by the political ambitions of Prussia. He had almost no interest in the actual administration of government, treaties, taxes, armies bored him. What obsessed him from childhood was beauty, architecture, music. Above all, the operas of a composer named Richard Wagner, whose grand mythic stories of gods and swan knights captured Ludwig's imagination so completely that he brought Wagner to his court, funded his work personally, and began imagining castles that looked like they'd stepped directly out of the operas themselves. Over roughly 2 decades, Ludwig commissioned 3 of the most extravagant private building projects in European history. Neuschwanstein, a fantasy castle rising from an alpine cliff face, Linderhof, a palace modeled partly on Versailles, and Herrenchiemsee, an even more direct and even more expensive tribute to the French Sun King. He paid for none of it from the state treasury. He insisted publicly and repeatedly that every shilling came from his own personal fortune and private loans, not from Bavaria's taxpayers. This distinction would matter enormously to what happened next. Because privately, behind the scenes, his ministers could see clearly, and Ludwig apparently could not. The king's personal fortune had run out years earlier. What was funding the fairy tale now was debt, enormous, compounding, increasingly unpayable debt, owed to banks across Europe who were beginning, quietly, to ask Bavaria's government when they intended to collect. By the mid-1880s, Ludwig's debts were estimated at several million marks. Awesome that, if creditors called it in publicly, threatened to become a genuine constitutional crisis for the Kingdom of Bavaria, dragging the royal family's finances into open scandal, at precisely the moment German unification under Prussia was reshaping the balance of power across the continent. There was also a second, quieter problem. Ludwig had, over the years, withdrawn almost entirely from public life. He avoided state functions. He preferred to travel by night, alone through the mountains near his castles, sometimes going days without seeing another living soul except servants. To a modern reader, this might read as an introvert avoiding a job he never wanted. To his ministers in 1886, writing in the language of Victorian psychiatry, it read as something else entirely: evidence. 4 of Ludwig's own ministers, led by a man determined to see the king removed, began quietly assembling a case for his mental incapacity. They gathered second-hand testimony from servants. They collected rumors. They did not, at any point before signing the final report, arrange for the king himself to be personally examined by a psychiatrist. On June 8, 1886, a medical commission, again without ever meeting Ludwig in person, declared him mentally unfit to rule. The following day he was deposed. A king had just been removed from his own throne in his own country, based on a diagnosis written by doctors who had never once sat in a room with him. The man who benefited most immediately and most obviously from Ludwig's removal was his uncle, Prince Luitpold of Bavaria. Under the deposition, Luitpold assumed the role of Prince Regent, ruling Bavaria in Ludwig's place, with all the practical powers of a king and none of the scrutiny, since technically the crown itself still belonged to Ludwig, or after him, to Ludwig's younger brother Otto, who was by then confined with his own severe mental illness and considered incapable of ruling in practice. In other words, with Ludwig removed and Otto unable to govern, Luitpold could rule Bavaria in every way that mattered for as long as he lived, without ever formally being crowned, and without ever facing the political risk of an actual coronation, an actual challenge to his legitimacy, or an actual king capable of one day recovering and reclaiming the throne. He did exactly that. Luitpold governed Bavaria as Prince Regent for the next 10 years, until his own death in 1912, and is remembered by some Bavarian historians as a competent, popular ruler. Popular does not mean innocent. In any classic mystery, the relative who inherits power the moment the victim disappears is the first name written on the suspect list. Luitpold is that name here. The second man in this story is the one who was supposed to protect the king and instead ended up dead beside him. Dr. Bernhard von Gudden was one of the most respected psychiatrists in Germany, a man with a genuine, decades-long career studying mental illness. He was also the lead signatory on the report declaring Ludwig insane, despite never having personally examined him. After the deposition, it was Gudden who was assigned to personally oversee the deposed king at Berg Castle. He was, in theory, both Ludwig's jailer and his physician, the man responsible for the king's safety. On the evening of June 13th, Gudden made an unusual decision. He dismissed the attendants who normally accompanied Ludwig on his walks and told them he and the king would walk alone. It was, by his own later recorded reasoning, meant to build trust with his patient. Two men who had never previously known each other walked out along the lake shore together, unsupervised. Only one version of what happened next has ever been offered, and it was written by people who were not there. At 6:06 in the evening, Ludwig and Gudden left Berg Castle for their walk. A summer storm was building over the lake. By 8 o'clock they had not returned, and staff at the castle began to grow concerned. At around 10 o'clock, a search began. It took roughly an hour and a half of searching the shoreline in the dark and rain before both bodies were found, Ludwig's floating in shallow water near the shore, Gudden's nearby, showing bruising and injuries to his face consistent with a physical struggle. Neither man showed any sign of gunshot wounds. Neither body was formally autopsied in the way a modern investigation would require. The official cause of death, issued swiftly by the Bavarian government the following day, was suicide by drowning, with Gudden's death explained as the result of trying and failing to physically restrain the king. It is, on paper, a tidy explanation. It also does not explain how a lifelong strong swimmer drowned in water that barely reached his own knees. It does not explain why no water was ever recorded in his lungs, and it does not fully explain the extent of the injuries to Gudden's face, injuries that read less like a rescue attempt gone wrong and more like a fight. There is one more name in this story, and he was never a minister, a doctor, or a prince. He was a fisherman named Jakob Liedl, who worked the waters of Lake Starnberg and, according to accounts that surfaced decades later, may have been near enough to the shore that night to see more than he was ever asked to testify about. For close to 50 years, Jakob Liedl said nothing publicly. It was only in 1933, according to later historical accounts that remain disputed and impossible to fully verify at this distance, that Liedl, elderly and reportedly nearing the end of his own life, told family members a different version of events, that he believed the king had been shot, not drowned, and that he had accepted money decades earlier in exchange for his silence. No physical evidence from that account has ever been independently confirmed. A page allegedly copied from a diary describing the claim later disappeared from historical record entirely, adding one more layer of frustration to a case that seems, at every turn, to actively resist being solved. Whether Lidl's late-life account was the truth finally surfacing, or an old man's story grown larger with the years, is something historians still argue about today. What isn't in dispute is that a witness close to the scene stayed silent for half a century, and that silence itself is a kind of evidence, whatever the reason behind it. Let's lay out, the way a detective would at the end of a case, exactly what we know for certain, separate from what we merely suspect. We know Ludwig was deposed based on a psychiatric diagnosis written by men who never examined him. We know his uncle assumed full practical power the moment that diagnosis was signed and held it for the following decade. We know the doctor entrusted with the king's safety made the unusual choice to walk him alone, unsupervised, on the one evening that would end both their lives. We know the official cause of death fails to account for basic physical evidence. No water in the lungs, water too shallow to drown a strong swimmer in, injuries suggesting a struggle rather than a rescue. And we know that a witness near the scene stayed silent for nearly 50 years before offering an account that contradicted the official story. None of this, individually, proves murder. Any single piece of it could have an innocent explanation. Together, laid out side by side the way Bavarian officials in 1886 never allowed anyone to lay them out, they form the outline of a case that was closed in less than 24 hours, by the very government that had the most to gain from closing it quickly. No one was ever charged, no trial was ever held. The file, in the strictest legal sense, has never been reopened. Prince Luitpold ruled Bavaria for the next 26 years, respected by many of his subjects, remembered in most official histories as a stabilizing figure rather than usurper. Whatever he knew about the night at Lake Starnberg, he took it to his grave in 1812, and the castle, the fairy tale fortress that supposedly bankrupted a kingdom and cost aching his crown, was opened to paying visitors just 7 weeks after Ludwig's death. Today, Neuschwanstein draws more than 1 million visitors a year, each of them walking through rooms that a king who spent barely 6 months of his life inside them never got to finish building. Every one of those visitors photographs the same view, the white towers rising out of the Bavarian cliffside, exactly the way Ludwig imagined them. Almost none of them know they're also standing in the middle of the motive. The lake is still there too, a short drive from the castle gates. A cross stands in the shallow water today, marking the spot where the bodies were found. Every June, a small crowd still gathers there to remember him. Nobody has ever agreed on what exactly they're remembering him from.